In this Elden Ring video, I'm going to be showing you my Gravity God build, which is a level 150 quality build that uses predominantly Strength and Dexterity with a little bit of Intelligence to absolutely annihilate enemies and bosses at range. In order to do that, we use the weapon Fallingstar Beast Jaw, which is a colossal weapon that scales off these stats and has a fantastic weapon ability called Gravity Bolt. Gravity Bolt looks and operates kind of similarly to the Thunderbolt Ash of War, except that it does so in an AoE and does predominantly physical damage, but it has one other benefit that Thunderbolt doesn't have, and that's that it staggers enemies and bosses very, very easily. By chain spamming this spell over and over, you can basically stun lock bosses in some cases, or players, or enemies, and they really don't have any chance to react. And the thing is that this ability also does a small AoE around it, so if you do it into a pack of enemies, you can stagger them all at one time. Or if, a boss likes to dodge, sometimes they can't dodge fast enough to get out of the AoE, and you still clip them with damage anyway, and it's just absolutely phenomenal. The weapon ability, Gravity Bolt's damage, seems to increase with points into Strength, Dexterity, and Intelligence. However, Strength and Dexterity seem to do about the same amount of increase in damage of it towards the physical side, and Intelligence does a very, very poor increase on the Intelligence side. This weapon scales terribly with Intelligence in general. There just isn't really a way to get much more magic damage out of this build, so I don't recommend worrying about Intelligence or trying to increase the magic damage of this ability. You can actually take something like the Magic Scorpion Charm, throw it on, and go test this. You'll notice that your damage is only like 20 or 30 points higher than it would be without it, which is like a terrible increase in damage. It's definitely not 10%, and the negative of using that charm for this is that you actually take more damage, so there really isn't a benefit to using that, which is why I don't use that in this build. The best ways to increase the damage of Gravity Bolt are Shard of Alexander, which increases by 15%, and Ritual Sword Talisman, which just increases your overall damage by 10%. You can also use Flame Grant Me Strength to increase your damage by another 20%, because as I said, this ability is predominantly physical damage, so it gets buffed nicely from that ability, or a spell rather. Otherwise, just putting points into Strength and Dexterity and using things that increase your Strength and Dexterity is going to be the way to boost your overall damage. Besides that, I use a seal in my left hand in order to use Flame Grant Me Strength. You're not going to use this all the time since you don't really need it, but it will be situationally good for bosses. And I use the Frenzied Flame Seal here just because it weighs 0, so it doesn't add anything to my equip load. I don't even have it upgraded, as you don't need to do that for this. There are no other weapons or shield that I use with this build, but theoretically you could add a shield to this build since you have lots of strength. If you wanted to use a great shield, this would be a great weapon to do it with, because you can one-hand the weapon. It doesn't change the damage this ability does, whether you're two-handing or one-handing it, and you have such high strength you can use a great shield. Keep in mind, though, your equip load will be significantly higher, so you might need to put something in your Talisman slot to increase your equip load, but it's a good candidate for that. However, I find that I don't really need it. I'm basically killing anything before it really even gets close to me most of the time, so, kind of is what it is. When it comes to armor, I'm using the Okina Mask to increase my Dexterity, to apply +3 to increase my overall damage and the damage of Gravity Bolt, but you could use other helmets that increase your strength as well, like the Omen Smirk helmet, and there's a couple other ones, but really, you just want something here that increases your, strength or Dexterity predominantly in order to increase your overall damage. I have the Black Raptor's feathers for my chest piece to increase my jump attack damage by 10%. I don't really do a lot of jump attacks in this build, but I just find it's a nice little boost to damage when I do. And for the other two pieces, I basically use the heaviest I can get away with in order to medium roll. Besides Shard of Alexander and Ritual Sword Talisman, I also use Carrion Filigreed Crest for my talismans. This reduces the cost of this ability that you're going to spam, and I like it over the Ancestor Spirit Horn because sometimes you need to cast it twice to kill an enemy, so that's going to save you like 6 FP. Whereas if you kill an enemy after you spend it twice, you're only going to get 3 FP. And a lot of times when you're in boss fights, you just spam this. So it's going to save you 3 FP every spam, which outweighs something like the Ancestor Spirit Horn. The fourth slot, I kind of use whatever I want, depending on the situation. Like the Dragon Crest Great Shield is great for giving you better defenses. You can use the Green Turtle Talisman here to help you regenerate stamina faster. You could actually use the Ancestral Spirit Horn here to make, the weapon ability even cheaper, although I don't think it's necessary. There are a lot of really good utility ones here. There's nothing really that's going to boost your damage. You could use Radagon's Sword Seal, though, to boost your damage, but you're going to take more damage, so there's a trade-off there. I don't think you really need that, because usually you're killing things based on the stagger, not necessarily the damage, but that is an option as well. So generally how this plays is that you're going to be running around on the landscape, and you're going to be using your weapon ability like 90% of the time. just hits just about anything. It has really good range. You need to keep line of sight, just like Thunderbolt, on the target in order to cast it. but it has really long range. You can do it from any elevation, so you can cast it up onto something or down onto something. And if you're near something when you cast it and they stagger, then you can go in for a critical strike. And if you have something like the Assassin's Cerulean Dagger, then you can get all the FP back for that. That's an option as well. I generally find, though, that you would typically just kill things with 2 casts of this or 1 cast of this at range, Gravity Bolt. It's just so effective, and it's so cheap. It's like 10 FP in this build, and you have plenty of FP flasks, and you never take any damage, so you can add more FP flasks if you need, because you're just ranging everything down before it can get to you, and because you can stagger tough enemies while they're like moving up to you aggressively, because the tracking on the ability is so good and it has an AoE, you just almost never get hit, it feels like. The only time I feel like I get hit is during big boss fights where the boss is really huge, and sometimes it's hard to hit them and keep a track of what their attacks are. Or in fights where there are just like lots of ranged enemies and I have to like make, get up close to them or close in range in order to cast the spell while they're all ranging me at the same time. But a lot of times you can stun lock difficult enemies. Like if you're facing Crucible Knights, you can actually guard break them by spamming this ability, then knock them down. They'll never be able to get up. A lot of bosses, like the Fire Giant, for instance, if you hit his ankle, which is weak a few times, he kind of goes down to grab it. And then if you spam it a couple more times, he falls down. And then if you spam it, he goes into phase 2. And like you can skip almost all of phase 1 without, him ever hitting you, as long as you can get through the first initial attack. With like dragons and stuff, if you target their head with this ability, like a few attacks most of the time will knock them down. And then you can just, do a critical strike or go to town on them with spamming the spell even more. Like, it's just really devastating against particularly enemies that have a weak spot or enemies that don't take too many hits to stagger. Like the Godskin duo, for instance, if you use the Stone Barb Crack tier for that fight, they take 2 shots of this before they're staggered. So, like, they can't even get to you before they're dead. It's just absolutely insane. Moving forward with this build, if you want to take this build and run with it, towards 200, I would continue to increase Strength and Dexterity. They seem to keep adding decent damage at this point. Like, you could probably run both of those up to near 80 and still get decent damage. Another option you could do is take a few points in Faith and get Golden Vow in order to buff the damage of Gravity Bolt even more in your regular attacks as well. That is also an option, although I think I would probably take the stats in this build closer to 60 Dexterity and Strength before you went Faith 10, just to, get maximum damage that way, because the scaling is actually pretty good still at this point. And also, you don't have to buff that way. One of the things I really love about this build compared to some other builds is that you don't have to constantly buff. You just run around and you hit L2 when you need to use something and it dies. Like, you don't even have to get close. And it's just a very easy way to play. You don't have to manage buffs. So for somebody who doesn't like managing buffs like myself, it's a very fun build to play in that sense. As far as like NG Plus goes and onward, I don't know how much more damage you're going to be able to get out of this ability. You can probably get 200, 300 more points of damage from Dexterity and Strength and Golden Vow, maybe 400. But really, you're probably going to have to lean on the stagger mechanic of this ability moving into NG Plus if that's what you want to do, and find a way to, get critical strikes for your damage, probably. That's what I imagine how this will play as you progress further and further into NG Pluses. When it comes to stats for this build, I have 40 Vigor, 25 Mind, 25 Endurance, 54 Strength, 44 Dexterity, 20 Intelligence, 15 Faith, and 9 Arcane. 40 Vigor is just enough there to make sure that you don't die. You actually have pretty good defenses, particularly if you're using the Dragon Crest Great Shield, so you shouldn't die very easily with this build. Nothing ever really gets too close to you anyway, so you don't need a ton of Vigor. You could actually take points out of here and probably still be fine. 25 Mind is there enough to give you to play around with Gravity Bolt. It doesn't cost a lot of FP. You could probably pull 5 points out of this and still be fine if you want, but that's going to make it so you really don't have to worry about your FP at all. Endurance is at 25, not only to give you equip weight so you can wear heavier armor, but to give you some stamina. As you mentioned, you spam L2 with this a lot during boss fights, and it eats stamina. So it's good to have extra endurance here. And because this ability has so much stagger, you don't have to get maximum damage out of each cast, because when something's staggered on the ground, every time you cast, you're going to get free damage. 54 Strength and 44 Dexterity are there because 54 Strength was pretty much the point where you got the most bang for your buck in terms of damage from Strength, and it starts to taper off after that. And Dexterity is still going strong, so I'd recommend upping Dexterity first before going into Strength from this point, and then taking Strength and Dexterity up together. 20 Intelligence is there to meet the requirement of the weapon. We don't really use anymore. As I mentioned, the weapon has terrible intelligence scaling, and it doesn't really do much for your weapon ability. 15 Faith is just there to meet the requirements for Flame Grant Me Strength, so you can buff your physical damage by 20%, and we don't need Arcane. And lastly, if you're using this with the Flask of Wondrous Physique, you're going to want to use the Stone Barb Crack tier, as I mentioned, in order to increase the poise damage that you deal. This will allow you to knock down some bosses in 2 shots, allowing you to just get off to a devastating start and wreck bosses really, really fast. And for the other one, I would recommend something like Dexterity or Strength just to boost your damage further. Stay tuned for more Elden Ring build guides as we do on more 150 builds. I have a lot more builds planned, including some fan favorites that we've already done in their evolutions. Having a blast testing out all these weapons. Let me know what you want to see in the comments below.